I paint a lot of rocks and cliffs, and I've gotten some requests to cover how I draw them. So we're going to cover both how I draw rocks, and also what type of rocks can be useful to learn how to draw. We're also going to look at some other games to see how they are doing it. More specifically, we're going to cover how to draw these rocks, and show how they can be set up in a scene. So let's look at the most simple rock we can draw. We can either start with blocking it in and then adding line art, or drawing a shape using line art and then fill it in. We can draw a somewhat flat object, a half circle or just a randomly drawn line. If we would finish rendering this stone, the rock would look like this. Kind of fine, but simple. The next extension of making the shape of a rock is to imagine it as a 3D object. Here we try to define each side of the rock. This will help us create the 3D shape using shading later on. Being able to imagine and draw a 3D shape can be quite tricky if you're new to art, but if you really aren't interested in learning this, I have two quite decent tips and sheets that you can use. The first is to take a reference photo of a rock. Here we have one I took at the zoo. We take this photo into our drawing program and sketch out the important lines on top of it. So we outline each face or side of the rock corresponding to what we see on the photo. And now we can fill it in and shade each face. And now we have gotten a 3D looking object without really being able to imagine how to draw one. And if you own the reference, you can trace it and no one will really care. The main issue with it is that you can't really draw the most appropriate rock for your scene. You're never going to find a rock that looks like this pillar, so you wouldn't be able to draw it. So the second tip I would give is to use a 3D program like Blender and try to create the basic outline of the shape you imagine. And you don't need to know much 3D to be able to do this. You just make a cube, go into edit mode, subdivide it, and then grab some vertices and move them around until you get something quite close to what you want. Then you can screen grab it and just trace on top of it. And the added benefit of this is that you don't have to think about the light source. Blender does that for you. Now once we have the outline and conception of the shape of the rock, we move on to how to shade our rocks. The absolute simplest approach is to add a base color for the rock, then make the top of the asset lighter and the bottom of the asset darker. You can do some color and contrast shifting for the shading, but the main idea here is that you don't need to really consider light, and you don't need to shade according to how the shape of the asset looks. But the asset will still look kind of nice. The slight step up in difficulty can be seen if we look at this cliff or this wall, but it's still not that difficult. We approach it with light on the top and then dark at the bottom, but we also do it for each and every crack. It's not entirely perfect or realistic, but it's good enough to make the object seem 3D, and we really don't need to use that much brainpower in order to create it. This method can be seen in Wonder Boy. This game looks great, but if we look at how the shading for each rock is done, it isn't really that complex. We have our midtone, and then the top is light and the bottom is dark. Now we're starting to get into something that is slightly more difficult to produce. One side that is really dark, one side that is really light, and then one midtone. This again is quite tricky, but can be made easier using references or Blender. To make the rock look rock-like, I have 4 quite quick and dirty techniques. We can add small holes like this to simulate nicks in the rock, like we can see in this photo. Then we can add cracks in the rock, either using line art or using a slightly darker color. Then we can use a texture brush with quite a strong texture in order to simulate how a rock isn't a smooth surface. These are some of the absolute base tricks to make it look rock-like. But even if we want to make our rock look more realistic, we can still see these types of ideas. We just extend them a bit further. So if we look at this texture that I drew, when we add a small hole or circle, I shade the top of the hole dark and then the bottom of the hole light to give the illusion of depth. When I make a crack in the rock, I do the same thing. One side is in the shadow and one side is in the sun. How you decide which side gets the light depends on where your light source is coming from. But generally, if you use my simple approach, the light source will be coming from the top. We can also vary the size of the brush when we make our cracks to either simulate different rock blocks or just simulate small cracks. And we can draw the cracks sort of branch-like to show how a rock doesn't crack uniformly. And if we look at Wonder Boy again, we can see that these tricks are used repeatedly. We have nicks, we have cracks, and we have some texturing, but not much more than that. It looks great, but it isn't that complex. One more thing that I think can be important to add to make your rock look even better is moss or grass. It's very common to see in nature, and it tends to make the rock look significantly less empty or constructed. Another benefit is that it can help distinguish between platforming rocks and background rocks. So if you have both type of rocks in your scene at the same time, like here in Hoa, we can add moss to one of them, but not the others, to separate them just a bit and make it easier to learn the rules of the game. When we are making platforms, I think there are two quite common approaches that are both quite decent. One is a tiled approach, where you essentially draw a square block and then you just repeat them. And we can see that I've made this type of rock in this scene. These are quick and easy to do and are especially common if you tile your game, which is common in a lot of older or retro games. The other approach is the one that we can see in games like Hollow Knight or Eternal Noctis. You make the entire platform one sprite and design it to look cohesive. So here, for instance, we have an asset the same size as the previous one that still covers 3 tiles, but we've designed it to make it look like one cohesive platform that kind of looks like it belongs there and doesn't look constructed. For any type of ground we make, we're probably going to have to repeat that asset. So if we make a rocky ground, we're going to have to cover the seams somehow. We can either do a tile approach or just hide the seams by overlapping them. The easiest way of doing a rocky ground is to sort of stack half circles on top of each other. Once again, we shade the top slightly lighter and the bottom slightly darker. And then we add a gradient and fade to black. This makes it so we only have to render about 1 or 2 tiles and can ignore anything else. This can also help with readability and can look really good in tile games, like here in Celeste or like this in Momodora. In order to make this repeatable, I tend to render one side how I want it to look, then I make a copy and move it to the other side. And now I fix it so that the original lines up with the other side of the asset. And now it is repeatable. There are other methods for doing this that you might prefer, so it is worthwhile to check up how to repeat assets. An entirely different approach that I've done can be seen here. I made this pillar. If we look in this next scene, we can see that I used the exact same pillar, but repeated it to make it look like ground. And then in a later video, I just shifted the color slightly and repeated it similarly. Here you don't really need to care about lining up things perfectly. The seams kind of hide themselves. And then you just add other assets on top of it to hide where it doesn't look as good. So if you aren't tiling your game, this can be quite a decent approach. Another quite cool approach to rocks you walk on is cobblestone, which can be seen in this scene. Here you essentially repeat squared rocks with rounded edges, and then you add some cracks and nicks. To get a decent 3D look in this scene, I've stacked 3 layers of the asset. So the first layer moves slightly faster. The second is the one you're walking on, and then the third layer moves slightly slower, so basic parallax. And then I've used a program called Lighter to create a normal map to make the asset more reflective and 3D looking. We can see the extreme version of this in this scene. It can be quite cool, and in my opinion, it looks really good if you want to make something look wet. Let's now talk a bit about cliffs and caves. These are an extension of rocks, so the texturing will be quite the same. And there are several ways we can approach them. The first is by far the easiest, and I've used it in this scene on how to place your assets. All we're doing is to make very one-dimensional blocks. For these, we don't care about making them look 3D, which makes them extremely easy to make. I made all of these 3 in 10 minutes. And then you place them on different parallax layers, and we can see that we still get this type of 3D feel. Each asset is flat and 2D looking, but the way we have stacked them makes it feel quite 3D. The second easy method is the one I used in my Hollow Knight video. Instead of thinking of how a cave would look, I just made a few rocks and repeated them all over my scene. All I need to know is how to make a rock. And then I create the illusion of a 3D cave by placing each rock on a different layer. We can see overall actually that this is quite a common approach for Hollow Knight, which rarely has one big individual asset, but quite often just repeats smaller assets. The most complex method I use can be seen here and here. Now we're essentially crafting a big 3D block, and we have to figure out how large-scale blocks would fit together. These make no use of parallax, and we're basically using our knowledge of shapes and objects to make the 2D asset look 3D. Nowadays, I just tend to imagine the shape and draw it, and sometimes I make mistakes with it, but it's slightly faster than starting a 3D software and forming the shape before you start drawing. However, when I was younger, I used to do this a lot in Google SketchUp, and then use those models for my drawing. And if you do this a lot, you'll actually start getting a sense for it, and it will help you draw them in the future. But if you aren't good at drawing, it can be a really good way to ensure that your shape actually makes sense, because it's very easy to make impossible shapes by just connecting different lines and then shading them. Okay, so I think we have actually covered most aspects that I consider when I draw rocks and cliffs. So feel free to ask any questions or write requests down below. Thanks for watching. Bye.